That lake is a health hazard and the fish have to go!
That's what the HOA president shouted at a packed board meeting while pointing at a projected photo of my private lake. A photo she'd taken from my property without permission. She was red-faced, finger-jabbing, laying out her plan to chemically remediate the water, to eliminate all recreational fishing in the area. She'd even hired a so-called environmental consultant, a pest control guy with a marketing degree, to justify dumping copper sulfate into a spring-fed lake. My spring-fed lake. The one that sat entirely on my 36 acres. The one that feeds directly into the limestone aquifer, supplying drinking water to every home in her subdivision. She wanted to poison my fish. She ended up poisoning 162 families. Tell me, would you have warned her or let her drink her own medicine? My name's Owen Hadley. I'm 47. I work as a water treatment systems engineer for a regional utility company in central North Carolina, about 30 miles west of Raleigh. I've spent 22 years designing filtration systems, testing source water, and making sure the stuff that comes out of people's taps won't make them sick. I know water the way a mechanic knows engines, by instinct, by smell, by the way it moves. In 2017, I bought a 36-acre parcel at the northern end of what would eventually become Meadow Glen Estates. The land had been in a family trust for decades, old tobacco country that had gone fallow. Rolling hills, mature hardwoods, a slow-moving spring-fed creek called Otter Branch that pooled into a natural 5-acre lake at the base of a shallow valley. The lake had been there since at least the 1940s, fed by a series of limestone springs that percolated up through the bedrock. The water was clean, cold, and so clear you could see bluegill hovering 6 feet down in the middle of summer. I bought the land for the lake. Everything else was a bonus. I built a modest house on the hill overlooking the water. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a detached workshop where I kept my tools and my fishing gear. I stocked the lake myself over 2 seasons with largemouth bass, crappie, channel catfish, and rainbow trout from a hatchery in Ashe County. I built a small dock from cedar planks and spent most weekends sitting at the end of it with a rod in one hand and a cold beer in the other. The Meadow Glen subdivision went in starting in 2019. A developer named Branson Group bought 200 acres south and east of my property and started cutting lots. By 2021, there were 162 homes, an HOA, a clubhouse, a pool, and a set of covenants thicker than a phone book. The development wrapped around the eastern and southern edges of my land, and a lot of the newer homes had sightlines to my lake from their back decks. Here's the critical detail. Meadow Glen wasn't on municipal water. The whole development ran on private wells drilled into the Piedmont aquifer, the same limestone water table that fed the springs on my property. My lake didn't just sit on the surface. It was hydrologically connected to the groundwater system that supplied every well in that subdivision. I knew this because I'd reviewed the geological survey when I bought the land. I also knew it because it's literally my job. The HOA president was a woman named Vivian Schaefer, 54, former pharmaceutical sales rep. Moved into Meadow Glen in 2020 and ran for president within her first year, winning with a campaign built around community standards and aesthetic excellence. She had a smile like a realtor and the temperament of a code inspector. Vivian didn't just manage the HOA, she commanded it. Board meetings ran like depositions. Violation notices arrived like bills. And every conversation with her felt like you were one sentence away from being fined for something you didn't know was a rule. I wasn't in her HOA. My property predated the subdivision and had never been annexed into the covenant boundaries. But that didn't stop Vivian from treating the view from her back deck as her jurisdiction. The first time she mentioned my lake, she called it that eyesore with the fishing poles. The second time, she called it a liability. The third time, she called it a problem she intended to solve. It started with the geese. That's always how these things start, with something small enough to sound reasonable. In the fall of 2023, Vivian sent me a letter on HOA letterhead, claiming that my lake was attracting Canada geese that were migrating into the Meadow Glen common areas and creating unsanitary conditions on community sidewalks and lawns. She asked me to install goose deterrents, motion-activated sprinklers, reflective tape, maybe a border collie service, and suggested that if I didn't, the HOA would explore its options. I didn't respond. Not because I was being difficult, but because Canada geese migrate on their own schedule, and my lake was no more responsible for goose droppings on her sidewalks than the moon was for the tide. The geese came and went every fall, regardless of what anyone did. 2 weeks later, I found a laminated sign staked at the edge of my property, facing the lake. It read, Meadow Glen Estates, No Fishing Zone, HOA Resolution 2023-14. Below it, in smaller print, this water body has been designated a protected natural area by the Meadow Glen Board of Directors. All recreational activity is prohibited. I pulled the sign out of the ground and leaned it against my mailbox with a sticky note that said, You don't have jurisdiction here. Please don't do this again. 3 days later, 4 new signs appeared, 2 along the eastern shore, 1 near my dock, and 1 actually bolted to my dock post. That last one took some nerve. Someone had walked onto my property, down my path, across my dock, and bolted a laminated sign to wood I'd cut and fastened with my own hands. I sent a certified letter to the HOA board with a copy of my deed, a boundary survey from 2018, and a polite but firm statement that my property was not within the HOA's jurisdiction, and that posting signs on my land constituted trespassing. I asked for confirmation that it wouldn't happen again. The response came 3 weeks later, not from a lawyer, from Vivian, on HOA stationery. She acknowledged that my property may not fall within the formal covenant boundaries, but argued that the lake had significant visual and ecological impact on the Meadow Glen community, and that the board had a moral obligation to regulate activities that affect community quality of life. She fined me $250 for failure to comply with the recreational use resolution. I didn't pay the fine. I pinned the letter to my workshop wall next to a chart showing the pH levels of my lake water. Funny thing about working in water treatment, you learn to appreciate the difference between someone who understands science and someone who understands stationery. But the fine wasn't the worst part of that letter. The worst part was the last paragraph, where Vivian wrote, The board is exploring all available remediation options to address the ongoing disruption caused by recreational fishing on the adjacent water body. We trust you will cooperate before further measures become necessary. Further measures. That phrase sat in my head like a stone in a shoe. In my experience, people who talk about further measures in passive voice are people who've already decided what they're going to do and are just building a paper trail to justify it later. I walked down to the dock that evening. The lake was flat calm, reflecting the last pink light of the sunset. A great blue heron was working the shallows near the eastern bank, stepping through the water with that slow, deliberate patience that always reminded me of my father. He'd been a fisherman too, not competitive, not flashy, just a man who believed that sitting quiet near water was one of the only honest things left in the world. He died in 2016, a year before I bought this land. I think he would have loved this lake. I think he would have told me not to let anyone take it. I pulled my line in, cleaned my gear, and sat there until the stars came out. The bullfrogs started their chorus. A barred owl called from the tree line across the water. Somewhere south, in the subdivision, I could see the glow of porch lights and hear the faint murmur of television sets through open windows. Everything sounded peaceful, but it didn't feel peaceful. Something was coming. I could feel it the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm. Not with your eyes, but with your bones. In January of 2024, Vivian called an emergency board meeting. The single agenda item was aquatic wildlife hazard mitigation. Reggie Sullivan, a retired science teacher who lived on the edge of the subdivision and was the closest thing I had to an ally in Meadow Glen, texted me about it the same night. The meeting minutes, which Reggie photographed and sent to me page by page, revealed that Vivian had brought in a consultant named Dr. Harold Finn. I looked him up. He had a PhD in marketing from an online university and ran a pest control business out of a strip mall in Apex. His specialty was mosquito fogging and fire ant treatment. He had 0 credentials in aquatic ecology, limnology, or water science of any kind. Doctor. Finn's presentation, according to the minutes, claimed that stocked fish lakes within 500 meters of residential developments posed elevated vector risks for mosquito-borne illness and could contribute to nutrient loading that degrades community water quality. He recommended the board consider chemical remediation to restore the water body to a natural, non-recreational state. Chemical remediation. That's a fancy way of saying kill the fish. Vivian's motion passed the board 5-2. The two dissenting votes came from Reggie, who had been appointed to the board the previous year, and a woman named Patrice Owens, who told Vivian the whole thing sounded like a solution in search of a problem. Vivian overruled their objections and instructed the board secretary to research approved chemical treatment options. I found out about all of this 3 days after the vote. I immediately called the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality and asked about the regulations surrounding chemical treatment of private water bodies. The answer was clear. Any chemical treatment of a lake or pond that is hydrologically connected to groundwater sources requires a permit, an environmental impact assessment, and notification of all downstream and adjacent property owners. Dumping chemicals into a surface water body that feeds a drinking water aquifer without those steps is a violation of state environmental law, specifically the North Carolina Clean Water Act and the Groundwater Protection Standards under 15A NCAC 02L. I wrote all of this in a letter and sent it to the HOA board, certified mail. I explained, in detail, the hydrological connection between my lake and the Meadow Glen wells. I attached a copy of the geological survey, a diagram showing the aquifer flow path, and a summary of the relevant state regulations. I told them, in plain language, that any chemical treatment of my lake without proper permitting and my consent as the landowner would be both a criminal trespass and an environmental violation. Vivian's written response arrived 2 weeks later. It was one paragraph. It said, "The board appreciates your input and has forwarded your concerns to our environmental consultant for review. We remain committed to protecting the health and safety of Meadow Glen residents." That was it. No acknowledgement of the regulations, no acknowledgement of the aquifer connection, no indication that they'd read a single word of my letter. Just a form paragraph that could have been written by a chatbot. I saved the letter. I photographed it. I added it to the file I'd started keeping in a banker's box under my desk. Every letter, every signed photo, every meeting minute, every text message. My ex-girlfriend used to say I had a problem with letting things go. She was right. But some things you're not supposed to let go. Some things you're supposed to hold on to with both hands until the truth has somewhere to land. That night I drove to the hardware store and bought 4 trail cameras, the kind hunters use, with infrared night vision and motion activation. I mounted them at strategic points around the lake, one on the dock post, one on the big sycamore near the eastern bank, one on the access path from the Meadow Glen side, and one covering the northern shore where the springs fed in. Each camera uploaded wirelessly to a cloud server, time-stamped, GPS tagged, continuous. Then I sat on the dock, watched the moonlight move across the water, and waited. Spring came early that year. By mid-March, the dogwoods were already blooming along the ridge, and the lake had that green-gold shimmer it gets when the water warms, and the algae starts its first gentle bloom. I caught a 4-pound bass off the dock the first week of April, the kind of fish that fights like it has somewhere important to be. I released it and watched it disappear into the deep water near the springs. Then the water started changing. I noticed it on a Tuesday morning. The lake's surface had a faint blue-green tint I'd never seen before. Not algae. I know what algae looks like at every stage of its cycle. This was different. The color was too uniform, too chemical. I walked down to the shore and knelt at the waterline. The smell hit me before I even touched it. A sharp, metallic tang, like pennies left in the rain. I knew that smell. I'd tested for it 1,000 times in my career. Copper sulfate. Someone had put copper sulfate in my lake. Copper sulfate is a blue crystalline compound used commercially to kill algae, aquatic weeds, and, at high enough concentrations, fish. It works by disrupting the gill function and oxygen exchange in aquatic organisms. At moderate doses, it's a legitimate tool for pond management. At the concentration I was smelling, it was a kill agent. Someone hadn't sprinkled a little around the edges. Someone had dumped a massive quantity into the main body of the lake. I collected water samples immediately, 3 from the surface, 2 from depth, 1 from the spring inlet on the north side. I drove them to the county environmental lab that afternoon. I also pulled footage from all 4 trail cameras and downloaded it to my laptop. The footage from camera 3, the one on the eastern access path, showed everything. At 2:14 in the morning, 3 days prior, a white pickup truck pulled up to the tree line on the Meadow Glen side of my property. 2 men got out. They wore dark clothing and baseball caps. They unloaded what appeared to be 6 50-pound bags from the truck bed, loaded them onto a handcart, and wheeled them down the slope to the lake's eastern shore. Over the next 40 minutes, they cut open the bags and dumped the contents directly into the water. The camera had captured the truck's license plate. I ran it through a public records search. The truck was registered to Pinnacle Pest Solutions, LLC, Harold Finn's company. The same Dr. Finn who had presented to the HOA board about chemical remediation. The lab results came back 2 days later. Copper sulfate concentration at the surface was 14 parts per million. The EPA's recommended limit for drinking water sources is 1 part per million. The safe limit for aquatic life is approximately 0.1 parts per million. My lake was at 14. That's not a treatment, that's a poisoning. But the worst number on that report was the one I'd been dreading. The sample from the spring inlet, the point where groundwater feeds into the lake, showed copper sulfate traces at 0.8 parts per million. That meant the chemical was already migrating into the aquifer, the same aquifer that fed every well in Meadow Glen Estates. I sat at my kitchen table with that lab report and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. I'd moved past anger weeks ago. This was something colder. This was the feeling you get when you realize that the person who's been trying to hurt you has accidentally aimed the weapon at themselves, and they don't even know it yet. I called Faye Prescott that same day, a water rights attorney in Raleigh I'd worked with on utility cases. I told her everything. She said 3 words, "Don't touch anything." Then she said 6 more. "We need the state involved. Now." Within 48 hours, Faye had filed a formal complaint with the North Carolina DEQ, a criminal referral to the county sheriff's office, and a civil preservation order to protect the evidence at the lake site. She also sent a demand letter to the Meadow Glen HOA board, Vivian Schaefer personally, and Pinnacle Pest Solutions, informing them that their actions constituted criminal trespass, environmental contamination of a protected groundwater source, and potential violations of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. Meanwhile, the fish started dying. Not all at once. Copper sulfate doesn't work that fast on larger fish. But by the end of the week, I was walking the shoreline every morning and picking up dead bluegill, crappie, and young bass. The water had turned a murky teal that looked nothing like the crystal-clear spring-fed lake I'd known for 7 years. The herons stopped coming. The turtles disappeared. Even the bullfrogs went silent. I buried the dead fish in my garden and marked the date in my notebook. Every one of them felt personal. The DEQ inspector arrived on a Thursday morning. A woman named Dr. Anita Rojas, senior environmental scientist with the Division of Water Resources. She brought a field technician, a sampling kit, and the kind of calm, methodical demeanor that told me she'd seen worse than this, but still took it seriously. I walked her through everything: the lake's hydrology, the spring-fed system, the aquifer connection, the geological survey, the lab results, the trail camera footage. She spent 3 hours at the site, collecting her own samples from the lake surface, the spring inlet, the downstream outlet where Otter Branch continued south toward the subdivision, and, most critically, from 2 monitoring wells she had the technician drill near the property boundary. The monitoring well results confirmed what I already knew but needed the state to document. Copper sulfate had entered the groundwater at concentrations exceeding North Carolina's groundwater quality standards. The contamination plume was migrating south and east, directly toward the Meadow Glen well field. Dr. Rojas looked at me over her clipboard and said, "Mr. Hadley, how many homes are on private wells in that subdivision?" I said 162. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just wrote a number on her pad and underlined it twice. What Vivian Schaefer had done, what she had ordered, funded, and celebrated, wasn't just a fish kill. It was a contamination event affecting the drinking water supply of an entire residential community. Her own community. The people she'd been elected to protect were now drinking from wells that were slowly filling with the same chemical she'd dumped to kill my fish. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. Vivian had spent months calling my lake a health hazard. She'd hired a fake expert to justify chemical treatment. She'd overruled dissenting board members. She'd ignored my warnings about the aquifer connection. And now, through her own arrogance and willful ignorance, she had created an actual public health crisis, not on my property, but on hers. Dr. Rojas filed an emergency report with the DEQ director that afternoon. By Friday, the state had issued a preliminary groundwater advisory for Meadow Glen Estates. Every household received a notice. Do not drink tap water until further testing is completed. Bottled water stations were set up at the clubhouse. A mobile testing unit arrived on Saturday, and Vivian Schaefer, the woman who had bragged about taking care of the fish problem, was about to find out that the problem had followed her home through the pipes. I didn't celebrate when the advisory went out. There were families in that subdivision, kids, elderly people, a pregnant woman 2 doors down from Reggie, who were now afraid to drink their own water. That wasn't justice. That was collateral damage from one person's ego, and it made me sick. But I also knew that the only way to fix this, really fix it, permanently, was to make sure every piece of evidence was airtight. Every legal pathway was locked in, and every responsible party was held accountable in a way they couldn't spin, deflect, or lawyer their way out of. So I got to work. First, I organized the complete evidence file. Every trail camera recording, time-stamped and backed up to 3 separate cloud servers. Every lab report from both my private testing and the DEQ's independent samples. Every letter I'd sent to the HOA with certified mail receipts. Every response, including Vivian's dismissive 1-paragraph reply. Every photo of unauthorized signs on my property. The meeting minutes Reggie had photographed. The public records search on Pinnacle Pest Solutions. Harold Finn's fake credentials. The geological survey. The well monitoring data. I organized it all chronologically in a digital folder and printed a physical copy that filled 2 bankers' boxes. Second, I had Faye Prescott prepare a comprehensive civil complaint. The named defendants were Vivian Schaefer individually, the Meadow Glen Estates HOA as an entity, Harold Finn individually, and Pinnacle Pest Solutions LLC. The causes of action included criminal trespass, destruction of private property, environmental contamination, violation of the North Carolina Clean Water Act, violation of Federal Safe Drinking Water Act provisions, negligence, and fraud. Specifically, the use of community assessment funds to hire an unlicensed consultant and conduct unpermitted chemical treatment on private property. Third, I filed a Freedom of Information request with the county for all communications between Vivian Schaefer, Dwayne Branson at the Branson Group, and the county health department. The response came back in 14 days and contained something I hadn't expected. An email from Vivian to the county health officer, sent 2 weeks before the poisoning, asking whether chemical treatment of a nuisance pond required any special notification. The health officer had responded with a detailed list of requirements, including DEQ permitting, landowner consent, and aquifer impact assessment. Vivian had replied, "Thank you, we'll handle it internally." She knew. She'd been told exactly what was required, and she did it anyway. Fourth, I contacted a licensed environmental remediation firm in Durham, Clearwater Environmental Services, and got a preliminary estimate for lake decontamination and aquifer monitoring. The estimate came in at $420,000 for full remediation, including activated carbon treatment of the lake, long-term monitoring of the aquifer, and potential well treatment for affected homes. I forwarded the estimate to Faye. Fifth, I reached out to the Meadow Glen homeowners directly, not through Vivian's channels, through Reggie. He organized an informal meeting at his house, and I came with my water testing results, the DEQ advisory, and a plain language explanation of what copper sulfate does to groundwater. 23 homeowners showed up. I stood in Reggie's living room and told them, as clearly as I could, what had happened to their water supply, and who was responsible. I showed them the trail camera footage on Reggie's television. When the video ended, nobody spoke for almost a full minute. A man named Dave Chen, who had a 3-year-old and a newborn, put his face in his hands. I told them I wasn't there to blame them. I was there because they deserved to know the truth, and because the person they'd trusted to protect their community had instead put their families at risk. Reggie walked me to my truck afterward. He shook my hand and said, "Owen, I've been on that board for 2 years. I've argued with that woman about everything from mailbox heights to leaf blower schedules. But this is the first time I've been genuinely afraid of what she's done." I drove home in the dark, parked near the workshop, and walked down to the dock. The lake was still teal. The smell was still there. No fish jumped. No frogs called. The silence was thick and wrong, like the air in a house where someone has died and no one has opened the windows yet. I sat on the dock and looked at the water for a long time. Then I went inside and set my alarm for 6 o'clock. There was a county commissioners meeting the next week, and I intended to be there. Vivian went into full damage control mode the moment the groundwater advisory hit. She called an emergency HOA meeting, attendance mandatory, and stood at the front of the clubhouse with a prepared statement that blamed unauthorized third-party activity for the contamination. She never mentioned my lake by name. She never mentioned Harold Finn. She never mentioned the board vote that authorized the treatment. She called it an unfortunate environmental incident and assured residents that the board was working closely with county and state officials to resolve the matter. Reggie recorded the whole thing. He sent me the video that night with a text that said, "She's rewriting history in real time." But Vivian's real move was more calculated than spin. She hired an attorney, a real one this time, not a strip mall pest controller with a mail-order degree. The firm was Boatwright & Dale out of Raleigh, a mid-size outfit that handled HOA defense work and insurance disputes. Within a week, Boatwright & Dale sent Faye a letter asserting that the HOA bore no direct liability for the contamination, that the chemical treatment had been conducted by an independent contractor without board authorization, and that any damages should be sought from Pinnacle Pest Solutions and Harold Finn exclusively. That was a lie. Faye knew it, I knew it, and we had the meeting minutes to prove it. The board had voted 5-2 to authorize chemical treatment. Vivian had made the motion. The minutes were signed by the board secretary. Reggie had photographs of every page. The contractor hadn't gone rogue. He'd been hired, directed, and paid with HOA funds. Faye responded with a 12-page letter that dismantled every claim Boatwright & Dale had made. She attached the meeting minutes, the board authorization, the payment records obtained through our FOIA request, the email exchange between Vivian and the county health officer, and the trail camera footage showing Finn's employees on my property at 2 in the morning. She also cited 3 North Carolina appellate decisions holding that HOA boards are directly liable for actions taken pursuant to board resolutions, regardless of whether the work was performed by contractors. Boatwright & Dale went quiet for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the water crisis was getting worse. The DEQ had expanded its testing to include all wells within a half-mile radius of my lake. 8 wells showed elevated copper levels, not at immediately dangerous concentrations, but well above the state's groundwater quality standards. 3 families with young children voluntarily relocated to temporary housing. The county set up a tanker truck with potable water at the Meadow Glen entrance. Local news picked up the story. The Raleigh News and Observer ran a piece with the headline, "HOA Fish Kill Contaminates Community Water Supply." The story included quotes from Dr. Rojas, from 2 affected homeowners, and from Reggie, who told the reporter, "We were told this was about community health. Turns out the only health risk came from the people who claimed to be protecting us." Vivian declined to comment. The online reaction was ferocious. The article got picked up by a statewide environmental blog, then a national HOA horror stories account on social media. Comments poured in. People shared it thousands of times. Vivian's name became a punchline. Someone started a parody account called Vivian's Fish-Free Future and posted daily updates about fictional HOA violations like breathing too loudly near the retention pond and unauthorized possession of a fishing hat within community boundaries. I didn't participate in any of that. I didn't post. I didn't comment. I didn't gloat. I just kept building the file, checking the water, and talking to Faye. But privately, at night, sitting on my dock looking at the damaged water, I felt something I hadn't expected. I felt tired. Not the good tired you feel after a day of work. The heavy tired that comes from fighting something you shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. The lake was wounded. The fish were gone. The springs that had fed this valley for centuries were now pumping contaminated water. And all of it because one woman decided that a man with a fishing rod was a bigger threat than a drum of copper sulfate. I poured my coffee out and watched the ripples spread across the teal water. Even the ripples looked wrong. Everything about the lake looked wrong, like a face with the expression removed. The county commissioners' meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the first week of May. The meeting room at the county government center held about 200 people. When I arrived at 5:30, there were already cars filling the overflow lot. By 6 o'clock, when the meeting started, the room was standing room only. Residents from Meadow Glen, neighbors from surrounding communities, reporters from 3 outlets, and a camera crew from a Raleigh television station were all packed into a room designed for half that many. I sat in the 3rd row with Faye on my left and Reggie on my right. Faye had a briefcase. Reggie had a thermos. I had a folder containing a summary of the evidence, the DEQ's preliminary findings, and a written statement I drafted the night before. Vivian sat on the opposite side of the room, with her attorney from Boatwright and Dale, and 2 board members who had voted in favor of the treatment. She wore a navy blazer and pearl earrings, and held a leather portfolio on her lap. She looked composed. She always looked composed. That was her talent, presenting calm authority while everything she touched caught fire behind her. The commissioners opened public comment after the regular agenda items. I was 3rd in line. I stood at the microphone and kept my voice level. I introduced myself, stated my profession, and explained, in terms any layperson could follow, the hydrological connection between my lake and the Meadow Glen aquifer. I described the poisoning, the trail camera evidence, the lab results, and the DEQ's findings. I showed a simplified diagram of the aquifer flow path on a poster board I'd brought from home. I explained what copper sulfate does to groundwater and how long remediation takes. Then I played 30 seconds of the trail camera footage on my phone, held up to the microphone so the audio, the sound of bags being ripped open and powder hitting water at 2 in the morning, could be heard in the room. When I finished, the room was silent. A commissioner named Janet Liu leaned forward and asked, "Mr. Hadley, is there a current health risk to Meadow Glen residents?" I said, "The DEQ advisory is still active. 8 wells have tested above state standards. The contamination plume is still migrating. I would not drink the water." The next speaker was Dave Chen, the father with the newborn. His voice shook the entire time. He said his wife had been using tap water to mix formula for their baby for 2 weeks before the advisory was issued. He said he'd taken his daughter to the pediatrician for blood work and was waiting on results. He said he hadn't slept in 11 days. After Dave, 6 more homeowners spoke. Some were angry, some were scared. One elderly woman said she'd lived in the house for 3 years and had been drinking the water every day, and now she didn't know what that meant for her health. Vivian's attorney stood at the microphone and delivered a prepared statement that took up 4 minutes and said almost nothing. He expressed the board's deep concern, emphasized the HOA's commitment to community well-being, and stated that the association was cooperating fully with all regulatory inquiries. He did not mention the board vote. He did not mention Harold Finn. He did not mention my lake. Commissioner Liu cut him off. "Counselor," she said, "with respect, we've seen the meeting minutes. We know the board authorized this. What we want to know is what the board intends to do about it." The attorney paused. He looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at the floor. That silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard in a government building. The commissioners voted unanimously to refer the matter to the county attorney for investigation, to request an accelerated remediation assessment from the DEQ, and to schedule a follow-up hearing within 30 days. Commissioner Liu added a personal statement, on the record, that the situation represented a serious failure of fiduciary duty by the Meadow Glen HOA board. Outside, in the parking lot, a reporter from the Raleigh station asked me how I felt. I told her I didn't feel much of anything. I told her the lake was still poisoned, and the water was still contaminated, and the fish were still dead, and no amount of meetings was going to change any of that. I said what I cared about was remediation, accountability, and making sure the families in Meadow Glen had clean water. She asked if I had a message for Vivian Schaefer. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said, she should have read my letter. The DEQ's full report dropped 3 weeks later. It was 47 pages long, and it read like an indictment written by scientists. The report confirmed that approximately 300 pounds of industrial-grade copper sulfate pentahydrate had been introduced into a private, spring-fed lake that serves as a primary recharge point for the Piedmont aquifer system underlying Meadow Glen estates. The contamination had migrated through the limestone substrate into the shallow aquifer at concentrations exceeding the state's 2-liter groundwater quality standards. 11 wells now showed elevated copper levels. 2 wells exceeded the EPA's maximum contaminant level for copper. The report estimated that full aquifer remediation would take between 18 months and 3 years, depending on treatment method and rainfall patterns. The report also noted that the contamination had been conducted without a DEQ permit, without an environmental impact assessment, without landowner consent, and in direct contradiction of written guidance provided by the county health officer to the HOA president. Faye filed the civil suit the same day the report was published. The complaint named Vivian Schaefer, the Meadow Glen HOA, Harold Finn, and Pinnacle Pest Solutions. Total damages sought, $1.2 million, covering lake remediation, aquifer cleanup, private property damage, lost property value, and legal fees. Faye also filed a request for a preliminary injunction barring the HOA from conducting any further environmental modifications and requiring the board to establish an escrow fund for remediation costs. The county attorney filed criminal charges the following week. Vivian Schaefer was charged with 1 count of unlawful contamination of a public water source, 1 count of criminal trespass, and 1 count of misuse of HOA funds. Harold Finn was charged with unlawful application of a regulated substance without proper licensing and contamination of a protected water source. Both charges were Class H felonies under North Carolina law, carrying potential prison time. Vivian's arraignment was on a Monday morning. She showed up at the courthouse in a gray suit, her attorney at her side, her face a mask of controlled fury. A crowd had gathered outside, homeowners from Meadow Glen, some with homemade signs. One read, "She poisoned our water." Another said, "My kids drank that." Dave Chen stood near the courthouse steps with his wife, holding their baby. He didn't have a sign. He didn't need one. Inside, the judge set bail at $50,000 and ordered Vivian to have no contact with HOA operations pending trial. She posted bail the same day. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting that evening. Vivian was not present. The court order barred her from participation. The remaining board members, led by Reggie, voted unanimously to remove Vivian as president, suspend all pending environmental initiatives, and retain an independent environmental attorney to manage the association's response to the contamination. Reggie called me that night. "She's out," he said, "for good." There was no triumph in his voice, just exhaustion. But the most significant moment came 3 days later, at the follow-up commissioners' meeting. Dr. Rojas, from the DEQ, presented the remediation plan. She stood at the front of that same packed room with a diagram showing the contamination plume, the affected wells, and the treatment timeline. She explained the process, activated carbon filtration for the lake, monitored natural attenuation for the aquifer, point-of-use filters for affected wells in the interim. The total estimated cost, $580,000. When she finished, Commissioner Liu asked who would bear the cost. The county attorney stood and explained that under state environmental law, the responsible parties, the HOA and its agents, were liable for full remediation. The HOA's insurance carrier had already been notified, and the civil suit would determine the allocation of damages. A homeowner in the back of the room raised his hand. "Commissioner," he said, "I just want to know one thing. When can my family drink the water again?" Dr. Rojas answered. She said the point-of-use filters would be installed within 2 weeks and would make the water safe for consumption. Full aquifer recovery would take longer, potentially 2 to 3 years of monitoring, but the filters would handle the immediate risk. The man nodded. His wife was crying quietly next to him. Their daughter, who couldn't have been more than 7, was drawing on a notepad and didn't look up. I watched all of this from the third row. Faye was beside me, taking notes. Reggie was on my other side, his thermos untouched. I didn't speak at this meeting. I didn't need to. The evidence had spoken. The state had spoken. The commissioners had spoken. And $580,000 worth of consequences were about to speak louder than anything I could say. Outside, afterward, the evening air smelled like cut grass and magnolia. The parking lot emptied slowly. Headlights swept across the pavement. I stood by my truck and looked south, toward Meadow Glen, where 162 families were still boiling water and filling pitchers from a tanker truck because one woman decided my fishing rod was more offensive than their drinking water was important. I drove home. I parked. I walked down to the dock. The lake was still teal, still quiet, still wrong. But for the first time in weeks, I could see a faint shimmer near the spring inlet where clean water was pushing in from below. The aquifer was doing what aquifers do, slowly, patiently, carrying the clean water forward, diluting the damage molecule by molecule. Patience. That's what water teaches you. It never stops. It just keeps moving. The civil case settled 8 months later. The HOA's insurance carrier paid out $640,000, covering full lake remediation, aquifer monitoring, my property damage, lost fish stock, and attorney's fees. Vivian Schaefer was personally liable for an additional $95,000, which she paid by selling her house in Meadow Glen. Harold Finn's company, Pinnacle Pest Solutions, dissolved. Finn's pest control license was revoked by the state. The criminal case took longer. Vivian's attorney negotiated a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of unlawful contamination and received 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in the state of North Carolina. Harold Finn pleaded guilty to unlicensed application of a regulated substance and received a suspended sentence with supervised probation. The lake took a year to come back. Clearwater Environmental began treatment in June, pumping the water through activated carbon filters, aerating the lake to accelerate copper precipitation, and monitoring the spring inflows weekly. By September, copper levels had dropped below state standards. By December, the water was clear again, not the crystal clarity it once had, but getting there. The springs were doing their work, pushing clean groundwater up through the limestone, washing the damage away 1 gallon at a time. I restocked the lake the following spring. Largemouth bass, crappie, channel catfish, and rainbow trout, the same species my original stock had been. The hatchery in Ashe County gave me a discount when I told them the story. The driver who delivered the fish stood at the shore, watched the fingerlings pour into the water, and said, "Man, those are some lucky fish. They got a whole lake to themselves." I told him to give it a year. They'd have company. Reggie became the new HOA president. He ran unopposed. His first act was to repeal Vivian's recreational use resolution and issue a formal written apology to me on behalf of the Meadow Glen community. His second act was to establish a community liaison position, someone whose job was to communicate with adjacent property owners before the board took any action that might affect them. Patrice Owens took the job. The point-of-use filters came out of the Meadow Glen homes about 14 months after installation. The aquifer monitoring continued for another year after that. By the second spring, every well in the subdivision was testing clean. I kept fishing. Every Saturday morning, same routine: coffee, rod, dock. The bass came back first, then the bluegill, then the crappie. The heron returned in October, standing in the shallows like it had never left, hunting with that ancient, unhurried patience. The bullfrogs started up again in late spring. One evening in June, I was sitting on the dock at sunset when a barred owl called from the sycamore on the eastern bank, the same tree where I'd mounted camera 3. I sat there and listened until the call faded into the evening hum of crickets and tree frogs and moving water. Reggie came by one Saturday with a rod he'd bought at a yard sale. He'd never fished in his life. I taught him to cast, badly at first, then slightly less badly, and we sat on the dock together, lines in the water, not catching much, not saying much. He looked out at the lake and said, "You know, Owen, I used to think the worst thing about Vivian was the fines and the mailbox rules. Turns out the worst thing was that she never once stopped to ask what the water was connected to." I told him that's the thing about water. It's always connected to something. You just have to care enough to find out what. The sun dropped behind the ridge. The lake turned gold, then copper, then dark. A fish jumped near the far shore, a clean, bright splash that sent rings spreading across the surface. I watched those rings until they disappeared. Then I opened another beer and cast my line back out into the water.
What stays with me isn't the chemical spill, the trial footage, or the $600,000 settlement. It's that Vivian Schaefer was warned by Owen's letter, by the county health officer's email, by 2 dissenting board members. She had every opportunity to stop and ask the question. She chose not to, because for people like Vivian, not knowing is worse than being wrong. Owen didn't win because of money or connections. He won because he understood something Vivian never did. Everything is connected. The lake connects to the springs connect to the aquifer to the wells. When you poison one part of the system, the whole system carries that poison forward. That's true for water. It's true for communities. And it's true for the trust that people like Vivian spend years destroying and never bother to rebuild. The real lesson isn't about copper sulfates or groundwater regulations. It's about the danger of people who use authority as a substitute for understanding. Vivian didn't need to understand hydrology or environmental law because she had a clipboard, a gavel, and a board afraid to say no. Ignorance plus power plus silence is how communities get hurt. If your HOA has ever acted without understanding what they were touching, drop your story in the comments. I read everyone. And subscribe because next time I'm covering the HOA that tried to demolish a veteran's treehouse, and the entire neighborhood showed up with power tools and lumber.